Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you guys for coming once again to the presentation here with the Decriminalized Nature, Arizona. Today our topic is processing grief and loss. And we've got Saj Razvi here with us today to share his information with you on this. Before we get to that, Decriminalized Nature, Arizona is a group of wonderful people here in the state that have come together who believe in the value of entheogenic plants and fungi and believe that nobody should be criminalized for choosing to use these substances. So what we do is we seek to inform the community about these plant medicines and get support throughout the community to put out some resolutions and decriminalize entheogens. And this webinar is part of a monthly series of educational events that we put out there as part of this to spread the word and help remove the stigma around these medicines, get the word out there, and help people really learn all the benefits from this. So we're really excited to be doing this once again. We're excited to have all you guys here with us. Super excited to have Saj here with us. Before we get over to Saj, I just want to tell you a couple of housekeeping things. One is you'll notice a chat over on the right, I don't know, it's over on the right side of the screen. Unlike a live event where we tell you to put your phones away and shut up, we want you guys to chat, put your questions, your comments, your thoughts, whatever you've got, chat it in there. We've got people from Decriminalized Nature Arizona there to chat back and forth with you, to put your questions into the question box or whatever. So please put your information out there and exchange things back and forth, because a lot of great people here today. I've seen the names go by. Good to see you guys here. And then questions. So if you guys have a question, down in the bottom center, there's a link down there where you can ask a question if you want Saj to answer it, about today's topic. Put it right in there. Everybody else can go in and vote on those questions. And the questions with the most votes, or maybe the questions that the moderator likes the best, will make their way over to Saj and get those things answered. So again, it's just another way to interact and have fun and make this your own presentation along with all the rest of us. So with that, we might as well get started here. The topic, as I mentioned today, is processing grief and loss with plant medicines. This is very important to me personally. Some of you guys already know my story, but I basically lost my son to suicide about almost 5 years ago now. And as part of my learning, what I say is learning to heal with my grief, not from it. As part of learning to heal with my grief, I have turned to plant medicines, to the entheogens. And I can't say enough about the power that they have and how much they've helped me. So I'm very excited to hear from Saj and what he has to say and explore this very important topic. So I'll introduce Saj here. Saj Razvi is a psychotherapist and director of education at the Psychedelic Somatic Institute, a psychedelic therapy training institute and psilocybin-based intensive treatment program based in Amsterdam. He was a clinical researcher in the MAPS Phase 2 trial of MDMA-assisted therapy, and is the primary author of the Psychedelic Somatic Interactional Psychotherapy Treatment Manual. His primary interest is in the development of psychotherapeutic interventions that maximize the healing capacity of psychedelic medicine, and in the grassroots adoption of psychedelic therapy through the use of cannabis by private practice clinicians. So we're very excited to have you here today, Saj. So welcome. And if you'd like to start off with any kind of a welcome here, we're honored to have you.
Great. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, everybody in Arizona who's attending this on Decriminalized Nature. It's wonderful to be here. I will say that I have approached the world of psychedelics through the mental health lens, and I know what healing from mental health conditions and trauma can be like without these medicines, how difficult and long and impossible healing can be without them, and I know what healing looks like with them. So I am very grateful that you guys are around and pushing for legalization. I think it's a big move in our society.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a good group of people here working on this, and we need to get there, here in Arizona. So we're talking about grief and loss and healing that with plant medicine. So maybe start with a baseline and kind of tell us psychologically, emotionally,
Mhm.
when somebody in your seat is dealing with somebody who has, deep grief or loss, what does it even mean to say that somebody has grief and is dealing with loss?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say that, it's a powerful experience that people enter into. It's something that we will all face at some point in life. And, it's a powerful mix of emotions, of physiological responses, of your nervous system responses, brain chemistry. It affects people's attachment. Um, and it challenges a lot about our experience of the world. A lot of times we can get along in the world and we have our sense of spirituality and we have our sense of, whether the world is ultimately a good place or not. But when you're about to lose somebody you love, that that sense of the existential becomes very much challenged. It becomes very palpable in your face in terms of how you actually think about the world, how you actually think about, is this a good place? Am I is this person leaving this realm and going someplace good? Right. So I think a lot of those questions come up for people, a lot of belief systems questions. And of course, it can be traumatic in nature.
Hmm.
The one other, I think the sort of the big picture umbrella that I see grief or any intense emotionality under is that it is an altered state of consciousness. We tend to think that psychedelics are an altered state of consciousness, which of course they are, but there's a lot of other things, natural things that happen to us every day in life, like are very common practices or traditions that we have that lead us into altered states of consciousness, like spiritual practices, chanting, meditation, dancing, fasting. These are things that that push us into an altered state, and so the dying process, not just for the person that's going into that, but I would say all for their immediate circle, for the people all around them, that whole system is moved into an altered state of consciousness.
That's interesting. I never thought about grief itself being an altered state of consciousness.
Yeah, yeah, it cracks people.
Hmm.
We have our normal defenses, we have our standard ego in terms of how it functions in the world, and then when grief hits, it just cracks that. And
Yeah.
some people double down and try to become more functional, do more of what they did to get by in the world, and then other people it just sort of lays them out, and that can be, we tend to think of grief as a something to really struggle with and overcome, a pitfall. But it is also a phase of life. It is also potentially a gift that allows us to revisit relationships and revisit things that were unavailable in ordinary consciousness.
Yeah, it makes sense. So as a therapist, when you're helping somebody who's going through grief or about to go through grief,
Mhm.
what's a traditional way of helping? The traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, the
Yeah.
traditional way to approach that.
Well, we look at support systems that people have. We look at um, so the primary channels of traditional talk therapy or CBT is of course the talking cure, right? So basically, we have people engage with us and sort of uncover their emotional states, uncover things that have been going on for them that may not be that conscious for them. There's a lot of people will engage in some sort of meaning making processes. And then there's a sort of a new model. A lot of people on this call may be familiar with this older model that I think has mostly been debunked at this point, that people go through stages of grief in a linear fashion.
Right.
And we just don't see that anymore. It's an inaccurate model. And what's replacing it is sort of this idea of vacillating between especially during the grieving process, people tend to vacillate between stressors around loss and then stressors around building a new life. Stressors around, well, how do I do this now? How do I, how do I live life now without this person? And so people seem to have a natural pathway going between those two. And, let me also say that we are resilient as human beings. The statistics, the data on this is that 60% of people go through a very acute grieving process. And we don't see 6 months after the loss, most people don't have, long-lasting depressive symptoms or, other things that are impairing their ability to function in the world. However, that means there's, quite a bit of people still, maybe in the 40% range, that do have something that's called prolonged grief or complicated grief. And so, that does take other interventions.
Yeah. So in that process, the new model in helping
Mhm.
somebody get through this, how do plant medicines help facilitate that? How do they help dive into that?
Yeah, well, I would consider plant medicines a completely new model. It's not something that's been sort of researched or looked at in terms of
So it's not
how they
used
can.
in a current model of taking somebody through that. It's a completely new
No,
path.
no. I think when people choose to do plant medicine work because they know that this is coming up, they're going through this, then it's naturally the focus. But I don't think there's any kind of model that's been established around it, right?
In your experience or your thoughts around the medicines, what do you think the benefit is with that therapy as opposed to the traditional cognitive behavioral
Yeah.
therapy?
Well, I would say this about people using plant medicines for anything like trauma or other emotions that were so big that they couldn't digest them. These
Hmm.
are experiences that are so charged and so big that they're partitioned off. They exist in a dissociative state for many people, right? So one of the factors of complicated grief is that people have become walled off to what actually happened. Their bodies may be feeling the distress, like their blood pressure is up, things like that, but emotionally they can't feel it. And so, one of the things that plant medicines do is, well, they put you in contact with what's going on, right? We
Hmm.
know that they're fantastic for that. Uh, you know, we have all sorts of defense mechanisms that our minds engage when we're in an ordinary state of consciousness. And when using plant medicines, it just, we dive down below sort of those defense layers. So I would say, a very deep contact with what's going on, a very deep contact with the grief is one of the benefits of what we can do with plant medicine. Because once you see something, once your mind is able to engage something that is there, then you can work with it, right? Because
Hmm.
insofar as something's invisible, then it's there's nothing you can do about it,
Yeah.
right? And so it's pretty miraculous, the defense mechanisms that the human mind can manifest in terms of overwhelming experiences. And how plant medicine can both support us and give us a sense of a sense of attachment, a sense of meaning, a sense of connection to something much bigger that kind of supports us digesting these overwhelming experiences.
When
Yeah.
you talk about digesting overwhelming experiences, one of the things that I believe you've talked about and have experience with is people who have a terminal illness
Hmm.
and they are approaching their own death. So I guess their grief and their losses for their own life and for the grief and loss that they know that their loved ones are going to be going through. And we've all heard the studies out of Johns Hopkins with
Yeah.
the psilocybin studies. So when you look at that, how do you think about that treatment and how that's helpful to people approaching the end of their lives and also their loved ones in dealing with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think clearly from the data, both the qualitative and quantitative data, but just if people don't know, the quantitative data is something like 94% of the people that were in this Hopkins study for the terminally ill did not have, who, were experiencing significant mental health concerns, stress, anxiety, depressive symptoms.
Hmm.
Something like 94% were, at least in the short period of time, something like 6 months, were much better off. They were affected very positively with it, and then they found that number went down into the low 70s, I believe,
Wow.
for after that. So, but there's a caveat to that, Stuart, which is that again, I think people that are in the dying process, are in an altered state of consciousness. Dying is an altered state. You're not doing your regular ego functions. You don't have the same concerns that you did when, you're going to work every day and you're trying to pay the mortgage and everything like that. Your entire system has shifted towards completely different concerns. So I think something has turned on in the terminally ill. Some process has turned on in the terminally ill that is not on with the rest of us. And so I think because of that, because people are already halfway there in a way, I think when they engage with psychedelics, it's such a fluid, easier process for them. There's nothing to defend against, right? There's there's nothing to hold on to. So what you have now is this powerful process that then it seems like people begin to trust at that point.
There's almost already some freedom from their ego at that point.
Yeah. You're not identifying it within the same way. And so I think consequently, we can't quite use that population to say, well, psilocybin has this profound effect on depression. Well, because it's a very, I think, unique population. It's not something that can be generalized to the general population.
Yeah. You're already tapping into that ultra state.
Yeah, exactly. You're already halfway there. And I think, and especially the model that they're using, which is a high dose psilocybin model, which is, it's geared towards making contact with the existential. It's existential reconciliation, unity, consciousness, sort of, spiritual awakening, spiritual consciousness. And I think people who are dying are again primed for that layer, right? They're not doing psychotherapy with it necessarily. They're not doing the things that we might engage normally with a person in psychotherapy. The terminally ill, again, have very different concerns.
Yeah. Now, I know you personally went through some of this with your mother. I don't know if you don't mind maybe talking a little bit about that and how you dealt with her, coming loss, and then when you finally did lose her, and how you dealt with this, and how that whole thing played out, and what, if any, role plant medicines had in that, for you.
Yeah, I would say they had an enormous role. But let me give you, I guess, a higher level theory piece before going into the specifics here, right? Because
Please.
I think one of the things that I didn't mention that really does come up in this experience that I had with plant medicine and death and dying is that things that are incomplete in a relationship, and I think between parents and children, there are frequently many things that are incomplete, many things that are not said, many things around childhood that have question marks, right? Many places that, parenting wasn't optimal, right? And what I see happens is, and this happened in my case, and I think we see this with other people, is that all of those pieces come to the surface because this is it. This is this period of time is the last time you're going to have with this person in this form anyway. And so there's just something about the non-ordinary state that the family system goes into that, all the unfinished business, all the unmet needs, like if you had attachment pieces that didn't go very well in that early developmental period between 0 and 2 years old, those things come up, right? And I think a lot of times people will feel them and they'll try and partition them off because they're, it's not, they want to be there for the dying loved one. But I think it compromises people's ability to be there pretty, thoroughly and clearly and openly. There can be a lot of charge in places. And again, I don't know what to make of it, but it seems to be a gift, right? It seems to be a gift that's saying like, okay, you guys are going to get one more chance at this, and to see if we can, what can we do here? What can we can we make contact in a way? Can we correct something in a way that just, sets us up in a good way right now, So having said that, or I'm sorry, it looked like you wanted to say something.
No, you've got me on the rails here. So just thinking about that, because I think a lot of people in the audience are probably also thinking of their own cases where they had that moment to get straight with their parents before they passed, right? So that I think that's a pretty powerful thing you just shared with that to kind of set up maybe some of the things that happened between you and your mom.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that I had somewhat of a troubled childhood with my parents. I was born in India, but my family immigrated to the United States when I was a year and a half, 2 years old in that window. And there was a lot of stress involved around immigration. There was a lot. My mom didn't want to go. She was depressed around it. It was like there was a lot of upheaval around it. And I think consequently, one of the factors was that there was a lot of neglect and abandonment in my childhood. I remember watching 6 hours of TV a day and nobody would come and interrupt me or anything like that. And that was totally fine, things like that. Just other pieces like, I have an older brother, and we had drawers of photographs of him as a baby and an infant and being bathed and all these things happening. And there literally was not a single photograph of me. And I know that happens to the second born. I know that's like parents are tired, they're exhausted. They're like, well, we already got the pictures. We don't need it. But I think there's something a little more going on there if there's zero pictures, right? It's something else is going on. So for me, my attachment was incredibly poor. It was highly avoidant. And if people don't know what attachment is, basically, it's a process that happens between an infant and their primary caregiver between the ages of 0 and 2. And basically, it sets the stage for this infant's nervous system, because it's not a cognitive process. It sets the stage for this infant's nervous system to know whether their needs will be met, to know whether they're okay or whether the world is okay. So there's really big questions that are being answered for the infant mind during this attachment period, whether the world is a safe place, whether other human beings are safe. And basically, if needs are met roughly 80% of the time, you get what's called secure attachment. And if needs are met less than 80% of the time, but frequently enough, you get something called insecure attachment. So it's or anxious attachment, which is what that looks like in adulthood, is people saying, I need you, you're really important to me, but don't come too close. Don't like, so basically there's a fear that comes with intimacy, and also a clingy need that comes with intimacy. And then finally, if you have enough needs not being met, you get what's called avoidant attachment, which means that just the channels that infant has for human relationship just turn off, right? The infant system just goes into dissociation. They just don't need anybody, right? That kind of thing. But it's kind of a dead, numb, dead place. So anyway, I had pretty insecure attachment. And, working through it as in adulthood, because it would always show up in relationships. It would always wreck relationships, I would say. And then, becoming a therapist in my 30s and working with that. And, the one thing I would say is that you cannot rework attachment through any kind of cognitive verbal capacity, right? So because it's such a visceral experience. It's such a embodied nervous system experience that it's something you feel. It's not something you think through, right? And so, so this has been kind of an ongoing thing through much of my life. And now getting to the piece around my mom, and the reason why I spent some time talking about attachment is because that's exactly what came up in the processing here, which is, so I was running a pilot program in Amsterdam looking at psilocybin for mental health. We knew that this was going to start becoming legal in the US one way or another. So we wanted to get more experience with it clinically. And so, my mom in 2011 was diagnosed with endometrial cancer. And for the most part, it's a 5-year life expectancy. And so, she had beat the odds. This was 2019. So she had already beat the odds.
Wow.
And but we were under some kind of delusion that things were okay, and we're just going to keep trying other clinical trials and things like that. And so I was in Amsterdam, and then there were just things started going downhill, one domino after another domino, and we didn't know what was going on. And then I got this call from my mom saying, I don't know fully what's going on, but I think you should come home. Right? And so, of course, my system was in denial, right, and everything. And but some things happened that I can't explain why they have. There was an element of synchronicity or something like that. But I saw some things while I was there that made me think like, okay, this is different this time. And so, before leaving, I had met some clinicians in Amsterdam that worked with psilocybin in therapy on a regular basis. And so I asked them, I told them about my situation. I asked them, could you take me in with this? And they agreed to do it. And they were lovely people. They refused to let me pay for it. They just said, this is such a hard space that they just, donated their time. And, I will say that again, my system was primed for this. My system was now in the same kind of transitional space that my mom's system was in. I mean, hers was doing something quite different, but I was already there in some way. And so we went into this space, and initially it was a very mild experience. Initially it was just, I don't know how to say it, but like it started with like the train station in Amsterdam. I was, for some reason, like the medicine took me there, and it was almost like it was asking, okay, do you want to get on this train or do you not want to get on this train? And so, and initially I thought like, okay, well, I thought I was expecting more than this, but but so that's where it started. And then, it just like, I mean, if I'm happy to go into some of the details here, if that would be useful. Or, okay. So one thing that I saw so at the start of it, it was a pretty transpersonal experience, a pretty sort of cosmic level experience, where I just saw floating in space, like this huge infinity symbol. And it was gigantic, and it was half of it was cloaked in shadow. And on it were you could see these little lights, and they were all like, the billions and billions of beings that are in the world. And they were moving from one side of the figure eight that was in light and into the shadow side of figure eight. And so basically they were moving through life, they were moving into death, and then through death back into life. So, and I don't know what to make of that. I don't have necessarily a belief system around that or anything like that, but it was just something that I saw.
It presented to you.
It presented to me, yeah. Like I didn't grow up with it, like in Hinduism or anything like that. I didn't grow up with a reincarnation belief system, but it just made itself known. And then I just had to say yes to it. I just was like, okay, there it is. I don't know what to make of this, but there it is. And then the process shifted towards more of a animalistic embodied experience, where somehow I was just experiencing going through lots of different life forms. It was almost like I was experiencing all the different forms of incarnation, from animal life to plant life to insect life to things like that. I was just somehow seeing the world through those lenses. And I'll say, Stuart, and as part of this process, so with psilocybin, it feels like music is everything, right? That the power of music completely changed the landscape of what was going on. So when there was this enlightening music going on, then everything was sunlight, everything was daytime, everything was glorious. And but so the music basically set the palette, right? And then my mind would find things in itself that then came out in that particular palette of lightness and beauty. And then when the music would turn dark, oh my God, did things turn dark? And again, the medicine doesn't tell you exactly what will come up in that space. That's a function of, I think, your consciousness and the things that are hidden in your consciousness. But the things that started to get populated with this are incredible, right? So basically, there was a couple of things that I think were incredibly meaningful to this death and dying process that came up. So one thing was, like, I moved from sort of an experience of general life to the experience of my individual life, my specific autobiographical existence. And I could feel myself being born, right? I could feel the shudders going on. I could feel my body going into it. And then one of the things that was so clear to me when that happened was the world that I showed up in could not give a shit about me at all. It could care less. It was like the most stark, empty, uncaring world, right? And if you think about, parents that were highly stressed or depressed and misattuned, and I think the world that gets created in a child's mind is exactly that world. That this isn't just something that's happening between me and a parent. This is the entire universe that is empty of meaning and relationship, right? So
that insecure attachment,
big time. Yeah, it was manifesting
coming out like this.
Yeah, the abandonment, the neglect, the emptiness was coming out in this metaphorical experience of a completely dead world, right? And it was heartbreaking. I mean, it was just like there was nowhere to run from it. My system wasn't dissociating from it. It was just incredibly heartbreaking. And but I think one of the beautiful things about, so the type of work that I do as a therapist and the work that we combine with psychedelics is a very body-based modality. It's a very nervous system somatic modality. And the reason for that is, I think what I'm going into in this story is because we feel like the nervous system, the body, is capable of handling so much more charge than the cognitive insight-based pathways that the brain has for understanding things, right? So, I'll say I have never seen somebody heal from anxiety or depression or grief by thinking it through, right? I think your thought patterns can help things a little bit. You can, compartmentalize. You can kind of work with things a little bit, but thought processes ultimately end up looking like symptom management techniques to me. So again, not seeing people think their way through anxiety, grief, or depression, but I see people feel their way through those things. When anxiety or grief or depression manifests as a sensation in your gut, as that feeling where your stomach has dropped out from underneath you, that feeling where your solar plexus is tight and your throat is tight, and you're just feeling rage in all of your muscles, right? So the body feels like it can hold that experience, hold that charge so much more effectively than thoughts can. So that's exactly what happened in this experience. So, the world showed up as empty in this way, and then the heartbreak was physical. It was visceral heartbreak. So it was basically giving me all these pieces that, my system was completely blanked out around from childhood, dissociated around from childhood. And then what started to happen was a couple of things. One was like, I started to see how incredibly necessary it was for children to receive love from their parents. And that's something we all know to a degree, but this is something I felt in the moment of again, how painful that was when that wasn't happening. Yeah. But the part that really surprised me, the part that I didn't expect at all, was how much of a need it is for children to express love towards their parents. Right. So not just for children to receive love, but for children to express love. It's just such a profound need. And if you're around little kids and see how they are with pets or something like that, there's just a raw, tender sensitivity to life that, kids are like wonderful at expressing. And so I found that sort of this love pathway between me and this primordial relationship of my life, this primal relationship between infant and parent, or typically infant and mom, that was frozen, that was broken both ways, that I couldn't get the love and I couldn't give it back. And so that I found that I just saw in that moment that this mechanism could explain so much about my adult life. It
Yeah.
could explain. It was like it was just stuck, and until like this piece had worked itself through, like my adult relationships were not going to work. And so the way that the medicine, that the psilocybin manifested this experience, where I looked down and there was this frozen iceberg sprouting out of my chest. It was just kind of emanating out, and it was frozen love. It was the metaphor of frozen love, and it hurt like hell. Right? It was incredibly painful to see and feel this frozen love there. And of course, and so the way my body was processing this was through sort of intense muscle contractions, hyperventilation, convulsions that were going on. And I don't mean seizures or anything like that, but like intense body reactivity that was going on. And I will tell you, Stuart, that I mean, the people that I sat with, I mean, there was no way for anybody to be in that room and not be deeply relationally involved in that process, because it is such, it was such a relational wound that that my system in the processing of it pulled people into it, right? So basically there were two of them, a couple, and it was kind of an interesting dynamic, because one of them was clinically trained, one of them was a therapist. And the other person was not clinically trained, but they had a really solid childhood, right? And you could tell, and what this was, because the holding space was like, it's not a thought through process. It's like, what can you as a therapist manifest that plays out in the room, right? And so the person, the male who had a really solid childhood but was not clinically trained, was incredibly fluid, was incredibly able to move in relation to what my system needed at the time. And so there were times I was curled up on this couch, I was in a fetal position, sweating, and I had this person wrapped around me, literally, and these waves of intense charge and revelations that were coming with the psilocybin, like this frozen love piece, when it would show up, my body would go into these shudders, and his body would be the container for that. His body was curled around me and helping me hold that experience, right? And so it was a complete relational process, in some ways, really redoing attachment, right? So, when somebody's having an incredibly difficult time, the fact that they have a relationship there means that likely they won't have to dissociate. They can lean on the relationship. And that's exactly what was happening here. And so, these guys worked their ass off in that session.
I mean, it sounds like in that one session, they worked their asses off.
Yeah, very much so, very much so. And then, so there was this recapitulation of so much. And I can say that, like, the way that I was feeling my hand, and like I was kissing the back of this person's hand like it was the first hand that I'd ever touched. It was like I showed up in the world, and now here's this human contact. And it just broke me. It just, like, the heartbreak of touching somebody, of making contact as a corrective experience to something that didn't happen when you absolutely needed it. And the interesting thing about this is it wasn't me as an adult, as a 47-year-old adult, going back and thinking about this is what it must have been like as a child having this experience. It really felt, I mean, there was no 47-year-old adult online at the time. It was completely a child's mind. It was completely a child's eyes seeing a hand for the first time, touching for the first time. So yeah, it was extraordinary. It was, I mean, all of that memory was somewhere deeply back in my system that the psilocybin opened the door to. And then the flip side, so that was the masculine, that was dad, right? And so that was a really nice piece there. And then the interesting part was that the woman in the group, the woman who was clinically trained, but I think had some love wounds of her own, her system couldn't go there. Her system wasn't fluid enough to sort of step into that space. And so she was more removed and being clinical. And at first, it felt like a recapitulation of, or a reenactment sort of this, mother-child experience that I had early. But I'll tell you, I mean, how the fact that she couldn't go there was incredibly useful. It was like a trigger in the best sense of the word, because it
How did
just
that play
brought
out?
more.
I mean, were you recognizing that as this was playing out?
Yeah, because I there was a time in the session where my system said, okay, I've got this, my needs were met here by the masculine. Let me turn towards the feminine. And I tried to pull her in, and she couldn't do it. Right? She
And
couldn't.
you identified that in
Yeah.
your state. You identified, okay, she's not coming with me.
Yeah, exactly. I think that one of the things that happens in that state is your empathy levels are just super turned on, not only towards yourself, but to everything that's happening in the room, right? So this is a huge reason why therapists have to thoroughly do their work. If they're going to do psychedelic therapy, you cannot have an attachment wound and go to some place that your client is going to and asking you to go to. You can't get by that way. You have to do your work. So yeah, my system was intensely, I mean, granted, there's a possibility that it could have been a projection, right? That my system needed to project this experience onto the feminine here. I don't think that's what was happening, because even as things eased up and I was coming down from the medicine, that reluctance piece was still there. So yeah, incredibly valuable triggers, even when things don't go perfectly. And then I'm trying to think if there's any other piece to it. Yeah, just replaying so much, corrective experience with so many different pieces of childhood, of touch, of warmth, of being welcomed, of having people take delight in the fact that you exist. Things like that were very available in that experience. Now, I will say that after everything was done and over, and we were all just exhausted, sitting back, and I because this team did this 4 days a week for years, right? They would provide psilocybin sessions 4 days a week for years. And so I asked them, how many other sessions look like that? and
Right.
and the response was probably one other one, right? So
one other one that whole time.
Yeah, the entire time, in years of them doing this, the response was, yeah, people don't have that kind of a depth, full immersion, going there response that I had. And so I don't know, again, that to my speculative mind, that could be either, again, the door had been opened because I'm dealing with death here, right? And so again, I'm already in that altered state, so it just boosts what's already there. I think that's part of it. And I think the other part of it is just, again, I think that nervous system piece, the body, the autonomic nervous system is such a robust pathway. It knows what it can hold. It knows that it can channel a great deal of charge, versus the narrative circuits, I think, just get fried pretty easily on if you're trying to understand frozen love, versus like die when you feel frozen love in your chest, things like that.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a great feeling. So this whole amazing experience was prior to your mom's passing.
Yeah.
And so how did it help you cope, understand, deal with this pending event in your life? And then once your mom did pass, how did it help you grieve during that? Or were there more experiences that helped you with the grieving part of it? But first the part of dealing with your mom's pending passing here. How did this experience that you just described help with that?
Yeah. I would say that, I mean, there was so much in my system that was being cloaked by dissociation. There was so much pain in that early childhood experience that was being cloaked by dissociation, that I think that if I went in to be with my mom and still had all of those things just raging and screaming in silence, while I was trying to be with my mom, I would have splits, like I would be with her, but in a split off way, and I couldn't fully be with her. And I think my adult consciousness would be kind of confused and dissociating as well.
Hmm.
But what happened was not that. What happened was um, I felt like I could really be with her in a pretty incredible way. My commitment, like it was so thorough. It was just like I was committed to sending this person out with as much love as I could possibly give them. Because I know my mom had a love wound as well. I know my mom was, had insecure
Yeah.
attachment, and which prevented her from being able to convey and communicate. Um, and so like in her, you know, it, and so in her dying process, my commitment was just like, okay, whatever comes up for you, whatever twists and turns this takes, whatever, wiping of poop I have to do, whatever, all these things that you can't even imagine with your parents. It was just no question at all. It was just a
Hmm.
solid commitment. And it wasn't me. I had a lot of help. The family came together in a way that, we had never come together around this, because my mom was so central to all of us. And my girlfriend at the time flew out 3 different times during this process over 2 months. And so, you know, yeah, it allowed me to be associated. It allowed me to be present with her. It allowed me to like say things to her. It allowed me to like just see things about what was happening in the situation and still maintain my seat, maintain my calm place while things happened, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm eternally grateful to the medicine for, even, I'm incredibly grateful that something as deep and profound and considered unchangeable by traditional therapy as attachment can get changed by that medicine. But I'm even more grateful that it allowed me to have that relational experience with my mom.
Yeah, because it
Yeah.
sounds like possibly without that, without those breakthroughs and without really getting straight with her, you could have had a typical
Yeah.
parent-child ending there with contention and muck and emotion that would have gotten in the
Yeah.
way of that whole process that ended up being something kind of beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I was just a lot more cleared out for it.
Yeah.
It was a sort of an open space for it. That's not to say that there were incredibly difficult times. I think there absolutely were times when you just watch somebody that you love going through something so difficult that, I definitely did dissociate still around things happening. And so let me be clear with that. Just because, these medicines can heal things from your past, it doesn't mean it doesn't prevent you from acquiring new things in the future. I think it just makes you more resilient when acquiring, new stressors or new traumas in the future. And I think they sit differently inside of my system today. I think, I have a sense of the world as, an extraordinary place. I have a sense of the world as like an intelligent, responsive experience, as opposed to the sense of the world that I had from childhood, which I thought the world was numb and dumb and non-responsive and not alive at all. Right? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, it was a pretty profound like
Yeah.
worldview shift that happened
Huge
in that
change.
experience. Yeah. Yeah, no, I would say that, there was times in most of my adult life, I was a pretty solid atheist. Most of there were times in my life that I would, have, I would say, psychopathic tendencies, just
Huh.
based on this sense of like, what a meaningless shithole of an experience that we're born
Yeah.
into. So why don't I just keep kicking it? Versus what's, happening for the last few years since these experiences. So yeah, it's been a gift,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I miss
Wonderful
my
gift.
mom. Yeah, yeah,
Miss
yeah,
your
yeah.
mom.
Yeah, I miss my mom, and at the same time, I'm just like, if like I'm incredibly grateful for how it went.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
a beautiful, I don't want to say the word story, but that's all that's coming to mind. It's not a story, it's much
Hmm.
deeper, than a story. That experience of yours is really beautiful and amazing. Um,
Yeah.
you said the plant medicines made you can make one more resilient
Hmm.
to future traumas and future things that are happening.
Yeah.
And maybe one of those traumas came immediately for you, right? So you did all this getting straight with your mom and all that,
Yeah.
but then she died,
Yeah.
and you
I
were flipped
know.
right into the grieving process.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
number one, did it help you be more resilient and prepared for what was coming for you? And number two, did you have more journeys to help you with
Mm.
that grieving process?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think it had to have helped. I think that, I mean, I don't have a uh, version A of Saj and a version B of Saj to be able to do a
Mhm.
real comparison. But
Right.
I only imagine that if I didn't have that experience prior to her and during her leaving, um, I would be left with the way that she left, the discombobulation that was in the confusion that was in my system around it, and the dissociation that was in my system around it, plus everything from childhood that would still be there. So I think it's just, I think one of the things that helps with resilience is just, well, you don't have that much of a backlog of compromised nervous system states. You don't have that much of a backlog of traumatic experiences, compromising your ability to deal with present moment reality, the stressors of present moment life. So yeah, I think it really did help. I did end up with pieces of parts of me that had dissociation even after this experience. There's no doubt about that.
Mhm.
And I did do more medicine work, except for with cannabis this time.
Hmm.
Here, um, and like, so I mean, I'm kind of curious. I feel pretty good now. I feel like, it's been over a year and a half, and I feel pretty associated. I feel like it's sitting well inside my system. There's not big parts of it that are walled off or anything like that. I can
Wow.
revisit it. I can go there and, have a tear and then,
Mhm.
smile at who this person was in the last years of her life with me.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I want to talk to you about how the plant medicines and your own experiences have helped shape your profession,
Mm-hmm.
as a therapist. Is there anything you wanted to share about the journey leading up to this point before we get into that?
About me personally.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, well, I will just say that, in uh, so somebody with my background, with a lot of developmental repeated childhood trauma, childhood neglect and abandonment, they're gonna have a lot of numbness, a lot of dissociation in life. And I went to graduate school, I got out in 2005. And, so I was intently searching for modalities and things like that that I thought would be really helpful for me. And because talk therapy didn't touch this, you cannot crack dissociation with talk therapy. And so I discovered, and I was in Boulder, Colorado at the time, right? I went to Naropa, and um, in Boulder, like San Francisco, like Boston, like there's a couple of hubs around the country that have really high-end, cutting-edge psychotherapy modalities going on there. Boulder is one of those places. And so I found a somatic modality. It was a trauma modality that really targeted dissociation and really targeted body processing. And it was good. It was really good work. So I did 2.5 solid years of that work. And then at the end of it, I thought like, okay, this is good to, just process with my body this way. Now I'm going to go off, and I found a specialist, a therapist that specialized in working with attachment disorder. And so I did a couple of years of work with that person. And then, so I thought I was doing pretty well. And I still don't know if I could have had a successful relationship at that point because my paradigm for a relationship was pretty screwed up. But then in 2014, I got involved in the Mdma trial. I was one of the, the investigators, the clinical researchers for the phase 2 trial there. And as part of that, you have to have your own MDMA experience. So this was the first time that I'd had anything to do with psychedelics. And I will tell you, Stuart, that, I mean, for somebody who gotten years of really high-end therapy, and I don't want to discount it because it really was scaffolding for being able to do what came next. But I mean, one day of psychedelic therapy, I felt like completely like outpaced anything that had taken me 3 years to do otherwise. Like I was able to see things and experience things that my system would just not have let me know existed prior to
Because it
that.
jumps into the emotion.
It drops you into it drops you into emotion. It drops you into your body. It drops you into a heart space. I mean, I would say that my heart was incredibly armored, incredibly protected for good reason prior to that. And then, these medicines just have a way of sort of working their way in there and softening things and developing empathy. And so since then, and so I was even teaching trauma therapy to graduate students and professional therapists at the time. And after these experiences and what I saw in the clinical trials with MDMA, we just put our training on hold. I thought there's no way in good conscience we can train therapists to work with trauma and not include psychedelics. So we wanted to get more experience with it. We started a clinic in Denver, the Innate Path Clinic, which was designed to help us get more experience working with cannabis and ketamine. And then just recently, we relaunched our training program that is fully revamped to incorporate psychedelics at this point. And I would say one of the really amazing things that we're finding is that it's not, the magic is not in the medicine, right? The magic is really in the interaction between the medicine and your psyche. There's a thing called primary consciousness that you enter when using psychedelics, as opposed to the normal adult mind, which works in secondary consciousness. And I think the magic happens in primary consciousness, and then the modality and then the interactions that people have when they're in that psychedelic state of mind. And so I find that as powerful and incredible as that psilocybin experience was that I described for you, I fairly recently had a cannabis-assisted therapy session that was on par with it in terms of
Really?
what it was doing. Yeah, so this is not a case where, oh, here's a hierarchy of medicines and these things do this and these things do that. I think they all have their different flavor. They all have their different things that they specialize in, it seems. But generally speaking, they all put you in primary consciousness. And once you're there, I think the magic is us. The magic is our relationship with being that happens, and then the human relational interactions that can happen in that space. So I think it is really possible to have incredibly psychedelic, incredibly powerful experiences with things that are legal and available to us today. Right, people can have that with cannabis, with ketamine, things like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's one of the.
Well, good. We still want to decriminalize the rest of them.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
You want options.
Yes, we want options.
Not taking away from that at all.
No, I know. I'm just messing with you. So, just two quick definition type things. You've mentioned somatics a few times.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could tell us
before we go there,
what that is.
I don't know if I answered your question, the previous one. Can you ask it again?
You did. I just wanted to see if there was anything else in your personal background, because where I'm going next is kind of how have your personal experiences kind of manifested in your work as a therapist.
Yeah.
But before that, I got curious by some things you're saying, and I wonder if there's anybody else out there that might be going to Google right now. Number one is somatics, right? You said that a couple of times. So what is somatics? And then I don't know if you would be able to shed any light on what the difference between primary and secondary consciousness really is.
Yeah.
So those two things, if you could just give us a quick definition, and then we can go to the next one.
Yeah, great. So let me start with the primary and secondary consciousness piece. So this is a terminology that Robin Carhart-Harris uses. So if you don't know, Carhart-Harris is a neuroscientist. He's at Imperial College in London, and he studies the psychedelic experience under brain scans, so fMRIs and different types of, ways of watching the brain under the effects of psychedelics. And so he has this, I don't think he came up with it, but it's a theory that really gets backed by his data, by his research, which is called the entropic brain theory. And so basically, the human mind is capable of functioning in two distinct ways, and these different forms of consciousness are underpinned by different neurological states that the mind is able to operate inside of. So the first one is primary consciousness, and it's a consciousness state. It's a cognition state that we share with other animals. Right? It's not unique to being human. It doesn't conceive of time. It doesn't do sort of cognitive thought processes. It doesn't do meaning making. it doesn't do self-awareness, right? It's not like it doesn't have this metacognitive thing of looking at itself. But what it does do is that it gets created from sensation. Its information is from sensation, from emotion, from imagery, and basically it's in touch with like all what's called non-declarative memory. So all the memory that you have in your mind that says like, oh, when I was 15 years old, I went to summer camp and this happened or that happened. That's called declarative memory because you remember it consciously and you can put it into words, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's an entire world of what's called non-declarative memory, of experiences that you have that shape you, that you cannot put into words and that you don't have conscious access to. Right. So if you think about Freud's iceberg in Psychology 101, there's like 10% of the iceberg above the surface of the water that you can see. That's your
Mm-hmm.
conscious, rational mind. And then 90% of the iceberg that you cannot see is the unconscious mind, right? Or in Robin Carhart Harris's terms, that the 90% of the iceberg that you can't see is primary consciousness.
Hmm.
Right. And there's a self that goes along with it. So if you think about your dog or a toddler, there's somebody home, there's somebody there experiencing the world, conceiving of the world, but it's a very different person there than your adult self. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then so that's primary consciousness. Secondary consciousness is what you and I, and we're all doing on this podcast right now, right? This is the way when your mind is working in an ordinary adult way, you're in secondary consciousness, which means you can do, cognitive thinking, you can do meaning making, you can perceive time, the passage of time, things like that, right? And so the dynamic between this is really fascinating because there's a let me see if this is necessary as an explanation. It's probably not. But what I will say, I will say that if anybody's interested in this and in the model that we're touching on here and there in this conversation, we just had a paper that was published by the Journal of Psychedelic Psychiatry. And so if you just plug that into Google and it's their current edition, and it's called the Psip model. So it's a 35-page paper that we have published there, and I'll give you much more detail about this. But the very interesting thing I think about these two forms of consciousness and how they work is that that secondary consciousness suppresses primary consciousness, right? So basically, we have this animalistic form of awareness that's always operating underneath the surface, but it's kind of suppressed by our adult rational conscious mind. And the super fascinating thing, and what we see from the neuroscience scans, is that when you take a psychedelic, the part of your brain that it affects is something called the default mode network. And the default mode network, basically, that's what's responsible for secondary consciousness. So you take a psychedelic, it disrupts the default mode network, which disrupts secondary consciousness. And so what you find arising in place of our adult rational mind is primary consciousness. So essentially what Carhart Harris is saying is that the psychedelic state is not something that's being added to the picture. It's something that's being taken away from the picture, right? So basically secondary consciousness is a filter. It's a filtration system that helps us understand reality. And if you take it away, you get a much more sort of like a much more chaotic form of consciousness, which is the psychedelic mindset. Now, so what that's telling us is that psychedelics are pushing the brain neurologically in one direction, right, towards primary consciousness. And psychotherapy, on the other hand, so if you think about psychotherapy or talk therapy and what it's doing, we're doing things like reality testing or cognitive restructuring or, we're doing insight work or meaning making, right? So basically everything that I mentioned there is a function of secondary consciousness, right? So basically the way regular therapy works is to try to stabilize people by pushing them more towards secondary consciousness, versus what's happening in the psychedelic state is that the medicine is pushing your brain towards primary consciousness. So the idea that we have here is that a therapy modality should be designed to work in primary consciousness, not secondary consciousness, right? A therapy modality should be designed to work with the things that primary consciousness is concerned with, which is your sensations, your emotions, your imagery. It's not concerned with if things make rational sense. It's not concerned about, like the meaning that you're making about things. It's just, you're just seeing this part of you. That last part didn't make sense. But,
it's the two parts observing each other or suppressing each other.
Yeah.
And one getting released.
Yes, exactly. And then all the processing that we can do in a psychedelic state are processes that are specific to that state. They're not secondary consciousness processes. So I hope that made sense. If it doesn't, look at that paper.
Yeah, no, it totally made sense. And Kay will put the link to your paper there, the PSIP model.
Okay.
So people can go download that and then ask more questions. Because I'm sure there's going to be a million questions from that. Okay, so what about somatics? What is somatics?
Okay, so somatics is referring to the body, right? It's referring to body processes and things like that. So, think about it this way. Before we are distinctly human beings, and before we are able to have the ego and the thought processes that are specific to human beings, we are biological animals, right? We're an embodied animal before we're distinctly a human being. And so the idea with somatics is that there are natural homeostatic mechanisms that are part of the biology of mammals that we use all the time. So think about, like, if you overheat, your body sweats to cool you down. If you eat something sugary, your body releases insulin to rebalance the blood chemistry there, right? There are literally hundreds and hundreds of these self-correcting homeostatic mechanisms that the mammalian biology has that allows us to be on this call, that allows us to be alive, right? Where our bodies are constantly regulating themselves. And the idea is that the same kind of homeostatic mechanism that we have for that, we also have for the processing of stress and trauma states. Right. So we know, for example, that animals in the wild experience life-threatening level events on a fairly frequent basis, right? Things that we would qualify as traumatic, animals in the wild experience on a regular basis. And so, and if an animal doesn't survive it, then okay, it's gone, it's dead. But if an animal does survive an attack like that and it gets away, then that animal's nervous system has a way to bring it back to a neutral state, as opposed to a highly stressed or a traumatized state, right? So if you're in a fight or flight response because you're being threatened, and then somehow you escape the threat, then your body doesn't maintain you in that fight or flight response. It has ways of bringing you back down to calm. So that's a feature that we know exists in mammalian biology. And one of the difficult parts for us as humans is, because we've got this secondary consciousness process going, it shuts that homeostatic mechanism down, right? So when I'm talking about somatics, I'm talking about sort of that biological level of how your body knows how to process trauma, your body knows how to process stress, your body knows how to process dissociation. We tend to get in its way, right? We think we need to choreograph the processing of these experiences. Right. Yeah, we think we need to talk something through. So, think about a mouse that gets traumatized but somehow survives or something like that. It's not talking about it. It's not doing psychotherapy. It's not, so and we have the same exact nervous system as other mammals, right? We have the cognitive capacity, but our basic biology in terms of a nervous system response is exactly the same. So if that mouse is able to process stress and trauma without becoming cognitive about it, without going into the meaning of what happened to it or something like that, we can as well. And that's what we see with psychedelics. You can have an entire session working with psychedelics that have almost no insight connected to it. It's just sort of a rock and roll body process.
Just the somatics.
Yeah, that's what somatics are.
And so is that what you've been doing now? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say that if people wanted to see a video of what I'm referring to, if they go to psychedelicsomatic.org, there's 3 videos on that page. the number 2 and number 3 give you examples of exactly what we're talking about. The people in those videos are working with cannabis and trauma. So,
and it's pretty dramatic what they're going through in those videos.
It is, yeah, because trauma is dramatic. Trauma is intense. It's not a walk in the park. It's called trauma for a reason.
Right.
And it was intense going in, and it's intense coming out. But I'll tell you, so, and I'm willing to say that, people that go there and take a look at it, they'll probably be maybe a little shocked by it and say, oh my God, I never want to do that. But I will tell you, when people engage in this work, when they're in hell, and they've been managing being in hell for years and years of their life, like an hour of like intense hell, and then you're getting to the other side of something is well worth it. It's a good exchange.
Yeah, it's healthy, it's cathartic, it's therapeutic, and you're getting there in a new and different way that may not look like traditional laying on the couch and being comfortable kind of therapy.
It's not like that at all.
Not like that at all.
I would say most of therapy, most of psychiatry is again what I would call symptom management. We're helping people be more functional with the symptoms that they have. And I think the world of psychedelic therapy is completely different from that. I think the world of psychedelic therapy, we're talking about symptom resolution. And the pathway of symptom resolution looks very different than the pathway of symptom management. Even what I mentioned to you about attachment, right? So there are, I think most people think that most clinicians would say that, your attachment is pretty well set in place. It's one of those things like personality that doesn't change with time. I don't think that's true. It takes a lot of work with psychedelics, but I think something as profound about a person as their attachment style is changeable.
Yeah, what about grief? What about grief and loss? How do you work in psychedelic assisted therapy and somatics to work, somebody through grief and loss?
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's that different. I think, again, you encounter grief and loss. There's no workaround with it. There's no, like making it feel different than it is. I think you have to directly encounter it. And that's how the psychedelics really can help you with that. And especially the ones where, you feel more connected to the person you're in the room with. You feel more connected to the processes of life. You feel more connected to the fact that, like dying is a life process and life is good. And so maybe dying isn't so bad either, things like that. I think I would say that these are, again, not big cognitive things that necessarily create a shift. I would say these are more experiential shifts that happen when people engage in psychedelic work. They process grief, not unlike the way that I've been describing how, you can have a body process with trauma. You can also have a body process with grief.
So you're really processing it as opposed to working on the symptoms and just talking about it. You actually get into the actual act, the motivating act of processing it.
Yeah, I think so. As useful as, the standard treatments involve, like, supporting people having a social network, supporting people have connections, all those are wonderful, right? But I think those are again, in the camp of building resources for people. I think diving directly into grief and these types of experiences, which, by the way, we don't even guide people into as therapists, right? We don't, once a person's system knows what it's prepared to do, it dives in by itself, right? So one of the parts of the Mdma trial was that, if people don't approach their trauma, then the therapist team is supposed to kind of edge them towards it a little bit. We never had to do that at all. It's just something that happens for people. Like when the internal conditions are capable of processing these really wounded or dissociated places inside of us, our systems choose to go there. Right? It's kind of a beautiful impulse that we have. It's like, oh, okay, you got whatever you need in your backpack to climb that mountain. Okay, great, we're climbing the mountain now. That kind of thing.
Yeah, you open the door and it goes right through.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
it's so
beautiful.
organic. It's so organic. Yeah, you're not pushing anything. You're not pushing any part of you around. It's just what your system wants.
Yeah. So these medicines, you mentioned some that are legal, like where you are. Cannabis, ketamine. You do work in Amsterdam with truffles. And obviously, we're working on trying to get a lot of these access to a lot of the other entheogens available to people. How important do you think it is? And I think you may have already answered this question 1,000 times.
No, please.
But how important is it to have access to these medicines in a therapeutic setting?
I think it makes a world of difference. I think that psychotherapy is not the psychotherapy of the present and the past is not what we're going to be working with in the future. I think people are just not going to stand for it. If you have the option of going in, taking a deep dive, and really engaging these parts of yourself and coming out with them integrated into you, compare that to what happens with Prozac or something. I'm not bashing psychiatric medications, but again, there's symptom management pieces as opposed to, if it's possible to address depression by going through a process, I think people would far rather do that than not. And I think one of the, I'll say somewhat dangerous things that is happening right now is that there's such an excitement about psychedelics. Michael Pollan's book was on the New York Times bestseller for a long time, 60 Minutes. I mean, it's in the national consciousness that they're very effective for this. And if you consider, I've heard a statistic that in 2010, the psychiatric medication market in the U.S. was $40 billion. Right? And who knows what it is now at this point, but there's such a demand, there's such an impulse for people to seek those treatments, to seek those medicines, that they're either doing them by themselves, right? Or they're doing medicine or ceremony groups, or they're going to Peru, or they're doing underground work, right? And so sometimes you'll find great practitioners that are willing to do that with you, and other times you won't. But what I want to say is that it's something that's in demand. People want it, and it's being met by an underground market versus people who are, in the mental health world that can and want to do this above ground. And if there were the option to do it above ground, they would, right? And I think that's far safer for people to do it that way. And again, I'm not taking away anything from the ceremony context. I think incredible, beautiful things happen in terms of existential reconciliation, all sorts of things that happen in ceremony. But I would say that's spirit, right? That's something different that's worship. That's something different than the psychological context. And if people are choosing to engage psychedelics for mental health reasons, then they should do it with somebody who's really familiar and experienced with developmental processes, with working with transference, working with negative transference, working with trauma, things like that. And so, yeah, I think it would be really beneficial if these medicines were available to us.
And speaking about the availability, what are your thoughts on access to these medicines, right? I mean, you've got MAPS, and you've been involved in that with the MDMA studies, and you've got corporations that are investing in this and engineering some things. I mean, what are your thoughts on the future of access to these medicines?
Well, I mean, they're all coming down to us at this point through either maybe this will change in time, but it's still like a good move, but it's still, I think these medicines are coming to us through an FDA regulatory framework, which will be heavily regulated. These are medicines that are going to be, I would say they're going to be rolled out in a medical framework, in a medicalized format, which always means that things are going to be expensive, or that's for MAPS in the best case scenario. And MAPS is a nonprofit organization. They're trying to get, as many people using this as they possibly can. I get that. But I think, it's just the nature of what we're working with that the FDA is going to require a lot of regulation. And then on the flip side, you have something like Compass Pathways, which is, trying to patent psilocybin and make it's a very for-profit model. And I'm not completely anti-capitalist. People need to make money, and I get that. People need to do this in a sustainable way, and they should be able to, right? It's just, I think, do we want the rollout of these things that I would consider are right? This is nature. This is something that is our birthright, in my opinion. I think healing is our birthright, in my opinion. And do we want that to be controlled by, a government entity or by a for-profit corporation? My personal answer is no. And so one of the things that we're doing that we're very excited about, and we didn't know this before kind of exploring in this direction, but again, it's that piece where, something as easily accessible, as readily accessible as cannabis, when we pair it with a modality that's, again, designed to work with primary consciousness, we can really amplify the psychedelic capacity of cannabis. So my sense is that, there's other options at this point. There are other ways that we can start having a grassroots rollout of psychedelic therapy available to people that want it, and it's still being done in an ethical way. I think it can be rolled out through, there's a lot more clinicians, there's a lot more therapists, master's level therapists out there than there are MDs that are going to work with, MDMA. And so my mission, the thing that I'm motivated by, is that anybody who wants to get and is appropriate for psychedelic therapy has access to it. And I think we can do that with some of the things that are already here.
What about therapists and people working in the healthcare world right now? What avenues do they have to get trained in psychedelic therapies and the things like you're doing? Are there programs out there? Are there resources out there where they can go and learn these things?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes and no. I mean, I think, there's a number of, I think the two main types of programs that are out there right now are psychedelic integration programs. And they're more of what I just described, where people have their own experience, or they by themselves, or they're doing a ceremony, or they're doing something with an underground practitioner. And then after the fact, then they go to a therapist that practices psychedelic integration, and they're doing sort of talk therapy, insight work around trying to integrate that very powerful experience. So that's one, right? Psychedelic integration. The next one is the sitter school model, which is, I think, what CIIS is doing. And, it's what I would call a non-directive, non-interactional model, because it's the same thing that they used in the 50s, right? Basically, somebody goes in, they wear eye shades and they put on headphones, and they're in their own reality, and the sitter is there just in case like something goes wrong, or to help the person to the bathroom, right? There's not really much expectation of an interaction between the two. And so I think those are the two dominant things that I think are happening right now. And what we're doing is saying there are interventions, there's modalities that you can adapt with substances that are already here that allow you to work above ground and actually do psychedelic therapy in the session. Right. And so where our, Psychedelic Somatic Institute is a spinoff from what we were doing at our clinical site. And our entire mission is just, it's a training mission. We just want to get this out there as much as possible because we know it works. We've got like lots and lots of videos of people processing with it. And so that's one option. And of course, there's the MAPS option, which is, you'll learn sort of the, it's a little bit of a sitter training, but you get certified to work with MDMA with it, so I think that's what's available to people.
Okay.
What we designed though, is because, again, cannabis is fairly readily available in 29 of the 30 states, or of the 50 states. Yeah. I was thinking of Washington, D.C., sorry. But so we wanted the people who did our program to be able to roll out doing psychedelic therapy in their private practice setting. And so for example, we don't, for me, it's more important that people have clinical experience and some kind of good training rather than they have a license. So if somebody is in the healing arts world and they have experience, they've done a Hakomi training or a Gestalt training or a psychodynamic training, and they have some experience working with people as a coach or something like that, but they're not a licensed psychotherapist, we'll still accept that person because they have the right background for it. I would rather accept that person than somebody who had a license but just did, psychometric testing or something and didn't do clinical work with people. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, awesome. We have a couple questions that came in from the group. that I want to get to. But before I do that, do you have anything else you want to get out there that I haven't asked you?
Oh man, this has been pretty thorough. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it has.
This has been great. um, no, I mean, outside of, again, guys, I don't know how to say it, guys, but like the more that I do this work, the more that I feel, this is our right. This is, you know, this is what we're doing on this planet, to be in touch with nature and being and ourselves, and have an empathetic connection to life. And I don't have a lot of respect right now for things that get in the way of that. So,
I hear you. I hear you.
Yeah.
All right.
So yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right. Awesome. So a couple questions. Can you speak to unresolved grief and intergenerational trauma?
Yeah. So those are two different things. But so intergenerational trauma, I'll start with that. So that's basically, patterns that are passed on from generation to another generation. So it's not something that you felt directly, but it's in your space, right? And so, sometimes we'll find that people come in and they don't know where their patterns are coming from. They don't know where their symptoms are coming from. And the thing with most talk therapy and insight work, you're trying to understand the cause of things. You're trying to understand, where things come from. And that's completely different than psychedelic therapy, especially using somatics, especially with the body process. Because again, we're just concerned the fact that, you're going into the space and your body is doing this thing. And for me, I don't care where that comes from. I don't care, I don't need to know where that comes from. The fact is that there's charge in your system and your muscles are contracting. You're going into a panic wave, a panic response. And that's all that matters, right? And so, if that comes from a past life, or if it comes from intergenerational trauma, or if it comes from childhood, it really doesn't matter. All we're looking for is the reactivity, right?
Okay.
And we find it, right? Like you'll have people that have intergenerational trauma. Definitely seems to have its mark. It leaves its mark on people, and you notice it in their body, and you notice it in their nervous system.
Excellent. Yeah. A question about your interaction with the female therapist when you discussed your journey, which we're going through. Can you speak to the triggering that you experienced with her?
Yeah. So there were ways that, like, I asked her to move into contact with me, into touch or closeness or eye contact or something. I don't remember the specific details of what it was, but her system had a no to that. It was saying like, no, I'm going to stay on the outside here, right? And maybe it could have just been her boundary or something like that. But like, so is the question more around my trigger with it, or what happened?
How you triggered her?
Oh, I'm not sure. I don't know to what extent I triggered her. I guess my sense
it does say
was,
the triggering you experienced with the therapist. So did you experience any triggering?
Oh yeah, definitely, right? Because this person who was a stand-in for mom just couldn't show up in the same level of contact that her partner was able to. So yeah, no, it opened the door to a lot of grief. It opened the door to like, oh, this is what it was like, so it was like a memory of that, and then feeling rejection in the moment.
Yeah. All right. Ketamine and treating suicidal ideation. Any thoughts on using ketamine to help those who are feeling suicidal?
Yeah, it doesn't work in every case, but for a lot of people, it's pretty solid. I had a case where, this person was actively suicidal for maybe 2 weeks, and a lot of therapy time, a lot of after hours phone calls, a lot of their family support. Everybody was working to hold this person together. And then their psychiatrist, and this is before I think I knew anything much about ketamine, and their psychiatrist recommended it. And so we did ketamine assist. I ended up going with them to one of these ketamine infusion centers and sort of, engaging with them while they were doing the ketamine work. And after 2 sessions, suicide didn't make sense anymore to this person. So I think
Wow.
it can really pull people away from that edge.
Yeah,
Yeah,
excellent.
a friend of mine who, if anybody's interested, Craig Heacock is a psychiatrist in the phase 3 MDMA trial. He's in Fort Collins. And he also has a podcast called Back from the Abyss that he and I did 2 episodes with. So if people are interested, they can go listen to that. But he used to send people off to the ECT, the electroconvulsive therapy, for when he would exhaust first level, second level, and then maybe tertiary medications for working with depression, and then send somebody off for ECT, which is an intense thing to do. It's like a sledgehammer to the brain, and hopefully there's some kind of reset. And ever since he incorporated ketamine into his practice, he hasn't sent anybody off to ECT.
Wow.
Yeah, he swears by it.
Pretty amazing. Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And then the last question here, I'm not sure if I totally understand it. Maybe it already got answered, but do you know if NDs can be trained to do this type of therapy, or do they need a therapy type license?
Oh, no. I mean, again, we train. You mean the work that we do?
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, we train people who have a healing arts background, right? And so if you're in most states, you're not allowed to practice psychotherapy if you don't have the license to do that. And you should check. If you're an ND, you should check, because there's MDs can practice psychotherapy, nurse practitioners, nurses can practice. There's a whole lot of people in the medical profession that can practice psychotherapy if you wanted to go down that route. But even if you didn't want to go down that route and wanted to sort of list yourself as like, you have some kind of a background working with people, you have basic therapeutic skill sets, then you can list yourself as a psychedelic somatic interactional therapist. So the word therapist is not a protected term. Like there's no state licensing board that will go after you if you say that, I do this type of therapy, or I'm a therapist here. You just cannot use the word psychotherapy or psychotherapist as part of your title. So yeah, you can be trained to do this if you're not a psychotherapist.
Awesome. Well, Saj, we can't thank you enough for coming here. If anybody out there listening wants to get a hold of him and maybe do some work with him, his website is posted here, psychedelicsomatic.org. So that's how you can reach out to Saj. But I'm going to say what Belinda said here is your vulnerability and your sharing with us and your experiences have been absolutely invaluable to us. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise.
It's just wonderful to be here and doing this. It's a privilege, and again, it's all of our rights. Don't stop fighting for this. This is us.
Yeah, with inspiration like you've shared, we will definitely keep fighting. So thank you very much. Cable just put it out there. Next month, our presentation is psychedelic therapies for military veterans. So you can click that link and actually get signed up right now. We're going to have Jesse Gould from Heroic Hearts Project and Michael Cooley from the movie From Shock to Awe. We'll be here to talk about military veterans, PTSD, plant medicines. So please do that. Follow us on Facebook. Talk to your friends and family about what you learned today, because the more we spread the word, the more good we're going to do while we're doing this. Share this video. Put it out there. It's going to be on YouTube. It's going to be here at this link for a long time. So put it out there, share it. And everybody, thank you so much for coming. And again, Saj, thank you so much for sharing everything with us today.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.